I want to start a new series titled Hope for Hurting People, because everywhere I turn these days, I see that people are hurting. And so I want to follow the great miracles of Jesus as he encountered people who were having personal problems, and how that encounter led to transformed lives, and how that can apply, their transformed lives can apply to you and to me this week. And I want to begin by asking you a question. And the question is this: which miracle of Jesus, which great miracle of Jesus is recorded in all four Gospels? In fact, it's the only miracle that is recorded in all four Gospels. Which miracle is it? Which encounter with Jesus? Well, it's the story of Jesus and a little boy and 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish and 15,000 hungry people. John records in his Gospel, chapter 6, verse 1, these words: "After this, Jesus went away to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, which is the Sea of Tiberias. And a large crowd was following him because they saw the signs that he was doing on the sick. Jesus went up on the mountain, and there he sat down with his disciples. Now the Passover, the feast of Jesus, was at hand." After this, after what? Well, John tells us he had just been to the pool of Bethesda, where the blind and the lame and the sick and the crippled would come, and they would wait for an angel to stir the waters of that pool. The pool was lined with sick people who were having great problems in their lives. And there was a man there who hadn't walked for 38 years. And when Jesus encounters him, Jesus says, "Get up, pick up your bed, and walk." Well, you can imagine there in Jerusalem that word about Jesus spread like wildfire. Everyone wanted to see who Jesus was. But about that time after this, Jesus was moving northward up the Sea of Galilee. The Sea of Galilee is about 16 miles long. It's about 6 miles wide. It's also called the Sea of Tiberias because Herod Antipas, the ruler of that area, decided to rename that sea as a great honor to the Roman Emperor Tiberius Caesar. So sometimes we find it as the Sea of Tiberias, and sometimes we find it as the Sea of Galilee. So Jesus is moving from Jerusalem to Judea, his home turf, up there in Galilee. Little villages dot the shoreline. In those days, the villages were around 400 to 1,200 people. They weren't very big. People knew each other. It was like attending a large high school today. Well, what's significant about those little villages is that John tells us a large crowd is following Jesus. They are hanging on every word. Everyone wants to see him. And this particular day, there are 5,000 men, John says, who want to see Jesus. Now, when we look at this text, we have to say, okay, that's 5,000 men that John records, but there were probably 15 to 20,000 people gathered there, not only the men, but their wives and their children and their families and their friends. This kind of crowd was unprecedented in this area of Judea. Everyone wanted to see Jesus. And they had heard and seen the signs, the semia. There's no actual word for miracle in the New Testament. The Latin word is miraculum, from which we get the English word miracle. But there are 4 words that describe miracles in the New Testament. The first is ergon, works, great works. There's teros, works of wonders. There's dunamos, from which we get our word dynamite, works of power and mighty power, explosive power. But the word John uses here is semeion, a sign. It is pointing away to something, a direction. It is pointing to Jesus, and particularly John has in mind, it is pointing to Jesus as God. Now keep in mind when we use this word miracle, or here John is using the 4th word in Greek for miracle, semeion. When we use those words, we technically mean that they are a violation of the law of nature. Something beyond human understanding is taking place, and there is no other possible explanation than the direct hand of God. walking on water, turning water into wine, raising the dead. These are all things that only God can do. And so the primary purpose and function of a miracle is to authenticate the messenger. If someone does a miracle, it's a sign that is pointing to God being present among us. Only God could do that. So John says in chapter 6, these are semeion. They are signs. They are pointing to Jesus as God himself incarnate. And the people would respond with great astonishment. Everyone wanted to see Jesus. But Jesus had something different in mind. When he saw the crowds coming toward him, he went up on the mountain to the other side of the lake, and he sat down with his disciples to talk with them. In verse 5 of chapter 6, John tells us, Jesus, lifting his eyes then, and seeing that a large crowd was coming toward him, said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread so that these people might eat?" He said this to test him, for he himself knew what he would do. Philip answered, 200 denarii worth of bread would not be enough for each of them to get a little. Jesus is sitting there. He lifts up his eyes. He looks around. He sees in the distance this large crowd coming towards him. I think of the mass caravans of the immigrants fleeing from Mexico and Venezuela and heading towards our borders. Just this large crowd of people just carrying the minimal amount to get them through the next day or so. Well, to test Philip, he said, "Where are we going to buy bread and to feed these people?" Philip was a native of the area, and possibly he was in charge. His task or duty for the disciples was the charge of the logistics of providing food for them. And he understood it's getting late in the day and there's nowhere for them to get any food. Jesus is saying this to test him. Jesus knows exactly what he's going to do and how he's going to solve this problem, but he's trying to teach him something. This is what God does. He puts us in situations where he's trying to say something to us or teach us something, and he wants us to listen and to watch. Well, Philip understands it's getting dark. Time is short. In those days, they lived in a 5-mile-an-hour world. Nobody got anywhere very fast, any faster than a car or a donkey or a horse or a camel could carry you. They're far from home. There's no Chick-fil-A's. There's no Domino's Pizza. There's no McDonald's. There's no Subways around. Someone has to come up with the food. Philip, realizing the problem, tells Jesus a half year's wages. That is 200 denarii, a large amount of money. 200 denarii would be the equivalent of the wages of 200 days of farm working, of tilling the soil. Nearly half a year's salary. And Philip says this is not enough to give everyone even a mere meager bite of food. But Jesus has a different alternative in mind. In verse 8, we read, one of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There's a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But what are they for so many?" All of a sudden, Andrew, Peter's brother, shows up with a little boy, and he has 5 barley loaves, thin, flat cakes, the poorest kind of food, and 2 little bait fish, sardines, to add taste. In those days, this kind of little meal would be considered almost dog food for people. This little boy was very, very, very poor, and this is all he had. And there's so many people that Andrew realizes in Philip that this is insufficient for the resources that we have. Our best efforts will come up useless. Isn't it interesting that I think that's the world we live in today? We talk about the science, that the science has the answer to everything, or government, or technology, or education. But I want to make a distinction here. Science tells us how things that already exist fit together, how they work. But it can't answer the 2 toughest questions. The question of origins, where did everything come from in the first place, and the question of absolute truth and morals that are good for all people at all times. And we know that without some kind of absolute morals, without some kind of external truth source speaking into us, we're left with our own internal core to tell us what is true, which reminds me of the passage in Judges 21:25, where it says, in those days there were no kings in the land, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes. Isn't that kind of the culture that we live in today? We have so many factions and so many viewpoints, and no one to speak into absolute truth, or no absolute truth source to appeal to in our culture and in our lives. And here we're seeing that Jesus is now going to speak in behalf of God because he is God. He's going to speak God's word to the people. In verse 10, we read, in the solution to the problem that Jesus is going to bring, Jesus said, "Have the people sit down." Now there was much grass in the place, so the men sat down, about 5,000 in number. Jesus then took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated, and also the fish, as much as they wanted. Jesus begins to answer this dilemma and this problem that they're having by asking the people to sit down in small groups. It's the spring of the year, it's the Passover season, the grass is green, it's very lush. Luke tells us they sat down in groups of about 50 people. It took some time to get them organized, to get them under control. Jesus didn't want a panic to set in, so he just said, remain calm. Everyone sit down in small groups. And once they're seated, the little boy hands over the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and Jesus takes them and he gave thanks for them. The traditional Hebrew prayer, bracha, the bracha prayer, a prayer of thanksgiving. We don't bless things. I know sometimes we say, let's give blessing to this meal. We don't bless things. Only God has the ability or the power to bless things. We give thanks for things. I know we say, will someone please give a blessing? And technically, that's not really correct. Would someone please give thanks for that which God has provided? So Jesus gives thanks for that. And then he does the miracle. The fish and the loaves are distributed to the people, and they receive as much as they want. Everyone was fed. I know it was a violation of the law of nature. It was a change of quantity which is taking place here, a multiplication which Jesus is able to do. He did that with the water into the wine. So they're all fed as much as they wanted. And that's how God does feed us. And that leads us into verse 12, where we read these words. And when they had eaten their fill, he told his disciples, gather up the leftover fragments, that nothing may be lost. So they gathered them up and filled 12 baskets with fragments from the 5 barley loaves left by those who had eaten. And here we find the first lesson that we can apply to our lives this week in our lives. When they had eaten to their fill, they were full. The first principle I see in this passage is that Jesus is fully sufficient to meet your needs and my needs. And not only that, but when he does meet our needs, he wants us to value that. So gather up the fragments that nothing may be lost that God has given to us. Be faithful stewards of God's gifts and of his blessing. God miraculously meets the needs of these people. They are all fed. They are fully satisfied. This is what God wants for you and for me. He wants our lives to be fully satisfied. He is fully sufficient to meet our needs, your needs, and my needs, in a scale and a scope that is beyond our expectations and our belief. When he healed the blind man, or had the man walk at the pool of Bethesda, there were maybe, 12, 25, 50 people that saw that miracle. But here this day, there's a group of 15 to 20,000 people that all experience the full satisfaction of the filling of God in their lives. When I think of that, I wonder, to apply it to my life this week, what is my hunger? Where is my emptiness, my need? Is it in my marriage, my kids, my career, heart-rendering medical problem? Relationships, broken relationships, relationships that don't work so well. Times when I find myself in impossible places, where I get hurt or I get bruised or I get knocked down or nicked or wounded or cut or confused. Where is my place of need? I was praying this morning and I was asking that question. God, I have a need right now. What is my primary need? The number one need that I have in my life, that hole in my life where I need to learn to trust you. And I've learned over time that if I look to my own resources to fill those needs, that's not enough. But the good news is the God of the universe is fully sufficient to meet my needs. In my knowledge, my understanding, 200 denarii wouldn't solve my problem. But that's my perspective, not God's. If we turn our eyes away from him to our own vantage point and our own resources, we find that we don't have much to work with. And we find that the world is a dangerous, hard place. So this miracle reveals the full sufficiency of Jesus Christ to meet our needs. Now, there's a second lesson to be learned here, and it's the often overlooked lesson towards the end of the story. I want you to notice the response of the crowd. Listen to what John writes to us. In verse 14, when the people saw the sign, the semeion, that he had done, they said, "This is indeed the prophet who is to come into the world." Perceiving then that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, Jesus withdrew again to the mountain by himself. Notice the response of the crowd, the often overlooked response of the crowd. They want to make him king. It's the Passover season. They have been looking for a time of restoration to overthrow the Roman government and the Roman occupation for years and years, for decades and decades. And here now they perceive Jesus as the king who can free the Jews and rescue them from this occupation of the Roman Empire. Now, the problem with this is that they want to use Jesus for their own personal gain and agenda. If we get God on our agenda, everything will work out right because we know what the outcomes should be. And we would have an enormous advantage. Our problems would be over if Jesus would simply listen to us and do what we tell him to do. Interestingly, this same crowd that's shouting to crown him as the king who has arrived, 1 year later at the Passover, this very same crowd, rather than crying crown him, will crown crucify him. Because Jesus withdraws from the crowd. He's saying to them, I am not on your agenda, I am on God's agenda. And when they found out that he was not on their agenda, they cried out, crucify him. Yes, Jesus withdraws because he understands his kingdom is a different kind of kingdom. So notice the response of the crowd. But also notice, in the third lesson that I think we find for this week here, notice the response of the little boy. And I'm going to read into this passage, but I think there's some truth to be found here. Somehow or other, Andrew pulled him by the scruff of the neck, or however he got him in front of Jesus. But there he is, this little boy with tens of thousands of people around, finds himself standing before Jesus. And in his hand, he has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, little bait fish, dog food. It was really nothing, but to him, it was his lunch, and his mommy had made it for him. Yeah, that's the way I imagine this story. I'm going to read into this. His mother had made it for him. I remember when I first started elementary school, and it was a hard time for me. I loved my home, my mother and my father, my sister. And here I am in a strange place with strange people. And I would just get this sick feeling of dread every day that I had to go to school. But my mother in the morning would make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. And she would wrap it in wax paper and fold it up and put it into a brown paper bag with an apple or a banana and a little treat for me to have at lunchtime. It was special to me. It was special to me because when I would sit at my desk at lunchtime and open that bag, my mother would also put a little tiny note in there that she loved me and cared for me and was thinking for me and praying for me. And it brought me into a certain attachment or intimacy with my relationships at home. See, that little bag really just had a peanut butter and jelly sandwich in it, or a banana, an apple, a little treat, a little piece of candy. It was really nothing, not very valuable. But to me, it was my lunch, and my mother had made it to me. It was something of great value. So the way I see this is that Jesus looks at the little boy and he said, I would like you to give me your lunch. And miraculously, the little boy hands over that which he has to Jesus. He doesn't say, but don't you understand? This is mine, and my mommy made it for me. It's personal. It's special. It's all I have. It's all I have. He doesn't say that. He says, okay, you want my lunch? I'll give it to you. I will give you everything that I have. I'll turn it over to you and release it to you. And he opens his hands and he gives everything he has to Jesus. And when he did, Jesus did a miracle. The greatest miracle that day, to me, that took place in the depths of the human heart of that little boy. The greatest victory was a little boy, rather than clenching what God has given him and his mother made for him, he releases and opens hands. It is the gift of the open hand. God is changing his heart. That little boy figured out what Philip and Andrew and the great crowd never saw. That the greatest joy in life is not me using God, it is God using me. It's not about my plan, it's about his plan. So this week I have a little assignment for you. It's one simple challenge for you and for me. I did it myself personally this morning as I was praying to God. It's to answer this question. What is it that I have that I need to let go of, that I have been holding onto and give to God? What is it? I identified something very, very specific this morning. And when I looked into the eyes of Jesus and opened my hands and I released it and let go and gave it to him, there was a change in my life. This is what happens with these great miracles of Jesus. They meet a need in that present day there, but they apply to you and me spiritually in our lives this very moment. So my challenge to you, to find that joy and that grace and that freedom that that little boy had, was what is it that you have that you're holding on to that you can let go of and give to him? And I see that that little boy's life was changed forever. Forever. He loved Jesus and Jesus loved him. And I imagine everywhere that little boy went, the rest of his life, he would say, yeah, that was me there that day, you know, and he didn't know it at that time, but they're going to read about this 2,000 years later. They'll still be telling the story of my lunch and what happened when I gave it to Jesus.